Hello, this is Dr. Scott Young, and today we have SG Anon in the house. And I just want to have a lot of fun tonight. We're going to get kind of serious, but we're also going to answer a lot of questions. So I just appreciate him being here, but we're going to do like our intro video, and then we're going to get into the questions here. So here we go. So how you been doing overall, though? How's life been going for you?
Good, my friend. Going very well. Thank you for asking. Good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you too. So today, do you have any special statement that you wanted to say just on a Friday night here? And we're going to put you up on Friday night as well too.
Nothing I think in particular. I'm researching right now for File 56. There's some really interesting crossovers that have happened with this relocation of PMC Wagner in the eastern area of Europe. We've got a lot that's, I think, getting ready to pop off in that area. And it's looking like August is going to be the month for a serious offensive operation undertaken by Russia. We're seeing preparatory game board moves being made, which you figure military logistics anywhere from a 6 to 8 week lag time after you get those operations actually in motion and towards their completed end. So you reconcile things, you make sure that your strategies are all good to go before you pop the champagne, so to speak.
Right.
And it looks like the champagne on that may pop in a big way here in the next 30 to 45 days. We're still seeing a lot of relocation of genuine Wagner units. We're also seeing, however, and this is what's very fascinating, we're also seeing more than 25,000 regular Russian Red Army troops being deployed into the Belarusian countryside, working directly with Wagner and the Belarusian Territorial Defense Force. So that tells me that Belarus and the Russians overall, this sort of Slavic nations alliance, has serious reason to believe that something could come out of Poland or out of the Baltic states or both in this next phase, and they're sort of fortifying themselves to prevent that occurrence.
Wow. So there's just amazing things. And again, we're guessing on the exact time frame, but those are the potentials over the next kind of time frame. Isn't that right?
Well, if you mean by potentials, talking about these large scale events, excuse me, I think that we're already into that phase now. I think that we're already off the starting line, if you will. We're in that race.
Right.
When we get to the next flag is when we get to the next flag. It could be any time in the next 3 to 4 weeks. It could be any time in the next 6 to 8 weeks. I think it's telling that Russia has essentially warned diplomatic entities in the West and in specific Western nations as well over the last 6 months to abstain from this conflict. In other words, don't make yourself a military target. And they've been very plain about how some of the Western world nations, like the United Kingdom, like the USA, they're not on the sidelines anymore. As far as the Russians are concerned, they consider us active parties in this conflict. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about the patience and the surgical sort of operation of how everything has gone to this point, and certainly how delicate Putin and other leaders that are on that side, that White Hat Alliance side, if we want to call it that, are being as it pertains to these sorts of hot button military situations. But it could come to the point where we have, some sort of kinetic exchange gearing up between very large, very powerful militaries in the world, right? That's never sort of happened before on this scale. President Trump keeps talking about those sorts of events quite a bit lately, has highlighted Kim Jong-un at least a couple of times along the way. In the last 2 to 3 months, highlighted Kim as a, quote, friend of his, with a big, quote, red in all capitalized button. We're seeing more and more rhetoric from these nation states that were sort of captured under the thumb of this deep state manipulative arm, and were made vectors for nuclear terrorism underneath the Hussein Obama administration. We're seeing a lot of saber rattling coming from these nations. Iran and Israel are talking again. We've got Israel talking about the situation in Ukraine. We've got Ukraine trying to destroy the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We have Little Rocket Man shooting off missiles again. So, at this point, I think that we're headed straight long into serious real world events here, or at least a presentation of real world events that's going to get a lot of people's attention before it's over.
Right. So if you're thinking about, what particular event of orders, a particular order of events would be for President Trump to come back in, because this is one of the big issues that we get on Telegram quite a bit is and people go, yeah, but NESARA can't come in with Biden in office. And I go, well, of course that's the case. That's always been the conversation out there. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, let's take this question in two parts, because it's going to be important to, I think, outlay the context, especially for the viewers out there. When we consider this idea of NESARA and NESARA, and we consider how that applies here internally in the United States of America, we've tried to do this in one fell swoop a couple of separate times before. We've attempted to sort of compartmentalize it all into one simple document, which I think is good spirited, right? It sort of lends itself to the idea of government transparency at the legal level. But one of the issues is we always run into some sort of snag. There's always some sort of snafu, or there's a major traumatic event pulled off by the deep state in response to these sorts of changes. So I think now, if we can interpret things in a little bit more of an irregular war scenario, maybe the implementation of NESARA or NESARA doesn't necessarily have to come in the idea of a new financial government, if we will. Maybe it has to come in compartmentalized sections where different components of the bureaucracy are dethroned or disempowered or removed, and different laws, both federal and state, are properly changed in a coordinated, directed period of time. I think that's what we're going through right now, to be perfectly frank. And so this leads into the question of, when does President Trump come back? I don't think, given the events that we're experiencing right now, that it's likely we see President Trump back before these major action events come into play and then see themselves through, which could take anywhere from a number of weeks to a few months, depending on the severity and depending on the rapidness. You could also transpire a lot of those events, and it's worth highlighting, in just a very short period of time.
So let me back you up. So what you're saying is that it's just as possible that that Trump could come back in some way, and then some of these crazier worldwide events could be happening while Trump is back in office, here in a little bit.
Well, not exactly. Maybe so. I think some of them probably could. You could make the case for that. But I think it's much more likely that we have some sort of World War III style scare event that happens, where we see a culmination of different things that sort of traumatize the public a little bit as they witness what is happening, and this bureaucracy that's willing to just wipe out entire populations to further its own ends. And I think after that sort of event pops off, whether it's kinetic and real, whether it is a scary event in the moment and is stopped by military coups, which I think is possible. As a matter of fact, I think that's plausible given the actions of the German continuity of government operation and the American, and sort of the similarities between the two of them. But regardless of that, we go through that process, I think. Then we arrive at the point of tribunals for war crimes, tribunals for bioterrorism, tribunals for election treason, tribunals for crimes against humanity, right? All of which sort of gets unearthed in this process, these scare events that we go through, and this sort of clarity that I think gets provided to the world by an interventionary force, if I can use the term. After that, and I think only after that, can we see a reasonable restoration of fair elections. And I think that President Trump would be probably the prime candidate. I think that we would learn in that period of time, post exposure of the actual emergency alert, if we want to go through that vector. I think it's very possible that the things we learn within that include the election fraud, not only in 2020, but going all of the way back for a couple of decades. Which makes President Trump the universally liked candidate, right? He's done nothing this entire time except harp on how the 2020 election was stolen. He says it so much, even the mainstream media has to say it and report on it. So everyone sort of understands that President Trump is one of those loudmouthed individuals out there at the top, and in the political space at the top, that is extremely vocal about the idea of the election was stolen from him. Whether or not you agree with the guy, there's a lot of people that are aware of that. So going through a process where there is some sort of discovery that all these governments in the world are just fake, and there is some sort of discovery that all of those fake governments completely stripped everybody of their rights anyway, and all of those fake governments are now going to try and plunge the world into total chaos and disorder and just mass murder billions of people. I think a stopping power comes into play with that. There's a moment of clarification after that, and then we move into the lawfully elected governmental space.
Well, isn't there I mean, and I think what most people are struggling with, and you talk about the continuity of government kind of thing, the COG kind of points that Derek Johnson talks a lot about, and you talk quite a bit about. But when we walk into 2020 and we have the massive election fraud that freaked a lot of people out, then we move into 2022 and people were very aware of what was happening, and it hit places like Arizona specifically and others, but Arizona very specifically, and we saw it real time happening. And then, so we have two separate types of elections. Those are a presidential that obviously has congressional relationships, and we have a midterm election, both that were clearly stolen elections. And then we have this dichotomy of Trump standing over here saying Trump 2024, and people ask the question, and I know they ask the same thing of you, and they say, yeah, but nothing's going to happen until 2024, which in essence means he's not going to be back. We're going to have to wait until he's back in office until January of 2025. And I'm going, you really think that the world can wait till 2025? And I look at that and I'm going, you're seeing through the matrix in essence. And I always say, step out of the matrix, because you just said it. Trump keeps screaming about the 2020 election, and you can't go through another type of election cycle without dealing with the past. So do you want to kind of expound upon that a hair more?
Well, absolutely. The symbolism with 2024 and November of 2023 and this period of time that we're sort of coming into now, right? Because we're on the last half of the summer, we're approaching the autumn season, we're approaching a number of Hebrew feast days, which I think are important to keep in mind as we go through this process. But that is a powerful symbolism going back to this concept of V for Vendetta, right? Which was a blockbuster movie that essentially describes exactly what is going on in the world right now. The government engineered pathogen caused mass disorder, chaos, and death around the world, which ushered in a surveillance totalitarian state, a digital 21st century version of the exact same, right? And so if we consider that, let's consider from November to November. If we were to see some sort of event pop off, say this fall, and I think it's extremely possible that we do, given what's happening with Russia and China and the Middle East in general, we could enter a period that is sort of unknown and original to the American system and the American way of life, and really the way of life of the entire world. We could enter a surreal period where there is some sort of suspension of governmental apparatus around the world. We could enter a period where there is no longer a straight and narrow financial transacted way of life. In other words, that system gets so disrupted that it begins to fall apart. Banks no longer have access to your money, or they don't tell you, or they don't know where it's at, or they don't know what to tell you, or maybe that they're not open. We just don't know. I think it's extremely likely that we don't actually go all of the way to the 2024 election in the traditional sense. I think it's possible that we have an actual, real, fair election in 2024, but I think a series of events preceding that and leading up to that, which will center a lot around this idea of World War III, and these different operations that are happening militarily around the world, both good and bad. I think that's really the barometer here at this point. We're under military law in some faculties, but we're also under continuity of government, which has to allocate for the preservation of civilian law. There has to be some amount of order and organization kept within the system, or the entire operation just falls apart. That's why neither side wants this to go overt before they're good and ready for that to occur.
Right. So if you think about, the EBS, I mean, I'm old school when I say EBS. I mean, obviously it's an EAS. EBS is just the way that I would call it, because that was the Kennedy idea. Of course, it's an EAS in the concept. Do you think that that is a worldwide event?
I do, because of the nature of the issues that we're facing, right? And we don't have to get into sort of the nebulous areas to understand the dangers that are happening in the world. We have a very serious situation between what I believe to be good actors and bad actors, even down within the militaries of the world and within the military industrial complex itself. And that sort of feeds into the intelligence community and the blackmail locus of control that goes around the planet. And so, because of the entrenchment, and we're talking, Julian Assange comes out and says, based on what he's been able to trove, that more than 95% of governments will come all of the way down. That nature and that level of entrenchment is sort of astronomical. Could you imagine trying to save a patient, if they were even still alive, on the table, 95% consumed by cancer cells?
Yeah.
It would be an extremely tall, nearly impossible order. So I think we do have to arrive at a precipice moment as one humanity. The information age gives us the vector and avenues to do that with. And so I think that we are forming an exponentially increasingly large number of patriot pockets and majorities out there in these different nation states. But at the end of the day, I think we all have to come to a singular event or a singular series of events that unites us in the same way that COVID has united us. Or united the ones that are aware of what happened with the COVID crime, right? Because we're still dealing with those who don't have that awareness.
So in essence, what you're saying is that there would be a singular event, or maybe a bigger event that would focus all of humanity, but in essence, we would have a worldwide EAS kind of thing happening all at once, kind of thing, for everyone clicking off in that way.
Well, let's just hypothesize just for a moment. One of the events that is constantly referenced in this process and has become more and more regular in the rhetoric of President Trump when he talks about this World War III style event is this nuclear scare, this Cuban Missile Crisis sort of thing. And we're actually seeing that narrative set up, placed with China and the spy base in Cuba. And now we have Russian warships docking in Cuba just within the last 48 hours, right? So we're seeing this preparation set up in some regards. But let's hypothesize and speculate just for a moment that Russia fired a nuclear missile at the United States of America.
Right.
The United States of America's STRATCOM and defense systems would immediately return fire, likely from boomers in the North Sea. Correct. And so what we would have is a situation within 10 to 15 minutes. We have ICBMs of extraordinarily powerful capability flying at two of the biggest nation states in the world. So more of the arsenal gets shot as this escalates within the minutes, right? Because it is a minute-by-minute crisis. London gets involved. Europe gets involved. They start shooting missiles off because they're worried that maybe those missiles are also aimed at them. So we end up in a situation where, in order to prevent total societal chaos in a singular moment in time, we would have to have a uniform alert of some sort happening all across the world. It would have to be some sort of simultaneous in the moment event for everyone relative to your time zone and where you're at, right? For some, it would come in the middle of the night. For others, it would be in the middle of the day. But the aversion of something like a nuclear catastrophe and really what amounts to a civilization-ending event for mankind, I think it's really what it's going to take to bring all of mankind together in a way that we push forward and throw this evil off once and for all.
So kind of like, boy, I cannot remember the guy's name, Matthew something or other. I'm blanking his name out. In War Games, in that 1980s movie. It was, with the big Whopper machine that they had, and it was pretty worldwide, when we were in the middle of the Cold War kind of thing. Do you remember that movie?
I'm familiar with the title, but I've not actually seen the movie.
It's a real kind of cool movie. If you guys ever haven't seen it, it's called War Games. And basically a kid hacks into the system from Seattle, which is so fascinating that he would go from Seattle, hacks into NORAD's system and gets into this system called Whopper. And he figures out how to play into a thermonuclear war and gets the system to play against itself and create ways of launching a thermonuclear war. Now, because obviously at the time frame we have the USSR, and it tries to find ways of fighting against each other and finding a way to win the war. And Then it takes over all of NORAD, and it has all of the codes to be able to launch the nuclear missiles. And so they're very upset that they can't take over the nuclear weapons at the time, because people weren't pushing the buttons at the right time. I mean, they weren't pushing the buttons when the president was intimating the time frame to actually push the buttons. And so the idea of the EBS, or at that time frame it would be a EAM, wasn't going to happen. And so it's such a fascinating movie when you realize what it was about. And yet we're kind of at that possible time frame where it was actually averted, because we went right down to DEFCON 2 in this. It's a fascinating movie.
What's incredible is the symbolism in that movie is really, really powerful, and is sort of in line motif-wise, if we will, with things like clear and present danger, or the sum of all fears.
Right.
And they tell us what their plans are in movies. They give us these hints. They show us these things. It's how they goof on us, but it's also how they adhere to some of their own spiritual principles that they believe in the same way that you and I have our beliefs.
Right.
Now, that being said, a nuclear style event, I think, has probably been averted. If I'm going to go out there and just give my opinion, and this is my opinion, right? And the reason I say that is because if we had truly lost any serious WMD control, we would have seen them deployed publicly by now.
Correct.
The narrative destruction itself is permanently damaging for them, and would be enough. For example, broadcasts like this would be enough for them to detonate rogue bombs, dirty nukes, things like that, if they had access to that arsenal. I don't think in many regards they have that sort of access anymore, but I'm not so sure that off-record black operators, if we want to call them that, or dark operators, are all accounted for, because this is an espionage war, and the matrix and the web is extremely, extremely deep. As we look at the process of the events that are occurring, we're clearly seeing some sort of a game board back and forth, and we're clearly winning. The issue, I think, with winning is that the desperation moves that come out of that other side that still have the public reins of information control in a lot of ways. I shouldn't say information control. I should just say information influence. I think the control has been stripped, but the influence still remains.
Exactly.
As we look at that opponent, they're getting increasingly more desperate, and they're doing increasingly more dangerous things. I think they're in uncharted waters where they're not truly certain how to respond to a given strategy design like they have always been able to before. But that also means that an animal is extremely dangerous, because it's at that moment of true survival. It's at that moment of fight or flight, make it work, right? Or you lose yourself, and you lose yourself in the process. And what stands for these individuals, I think, is really important to keep in mind. They stand to lose not just their own lives, but their livelihood and their lineage and their posterity going forward. They'll literally not exist in our history books anymore.
Exactly. Well, then, if to stay in the same motif here, so when an EBS EAS sounds, for instance, on your iPhone, so you would have a warning. The EAS sound would happen in the morning. For instance, we had one here in the Tulsa area, and it was very strange I think it was for an Amber Alert, which was very strange to the way that it happened. But it wasn't for an Amber Alert. It was for a storm, and it was just for a windstorm, and it really didn't happen in the right way. But anyway, though, there would be a warning. The perception that's been coming out, it would be like a warning in the morning, and then to stay on for later in the day. Would that be possible? So like a warning happening in the morning and saying, listen for the president to explain something for sometime later in the day. Does that make any sense, or how would you perceive that to happen?
Well, I think a tell in this particular issue is in 2018, we all received the first of what was called the Presidential National Security Emergency Alert System. which was a direct presidential message given directly to your smartphones vis-a-vis the information network that we have. And that was finalized, tested, and completed in 2018. I think it's likely that we see something like that delivered directly to your device, because that's the most effective way to capture the most attention of the world in the quickest possible time frame. Everyone has it in their pocket, and if it's not in their pocket, it's usually right in front of their face. So as we go through this process and we look at what that might be like, I think it's likely to be simple. I think it's likely to be something along the lines of, if we could speculate for a moment, the U.S. government, at the request of the United States military and the Pentagon, has detected a critical national emergency. Please stand by for further instructions, or please stand by for further information. And then probably will include a lot of, if you're in this area, please go here. If you're in this area, please go here. If you need to contact support services, these are the support services that are relevant to your area. And we can generate super advanced algorithms that are able to populate individualized geospatial data that can be directly delivered to people, and the information can be based on that. So I think it's likely that we see something along those lines. Now, for what period of time there is sort of disclarity, if you want to call it that, or murkiness, I think that's anyone's guess. I think that could go from as little as 2 or 3 days to as many as 14 or 15. Most individuals out there in the world can subsist pretty regularly, or I shouldn't say regularly, I should say pretty consistently. They can subsist for about 14 to 15 days. Beyond that, we start getting into things like food, water, any sort of travel that has to happen, things like that, right? Especially if some sort of curtailment to financial access is in the making. I've heard this phrase called the 10 days of darkness for a long time. I'm not truly convinced I know what it specifically is, or what it specifically is referring to. It's an interesting phrase on its face. It's possible, because Q tells us that this is possible, that it's purposeful disinformation put out there for enemy eyes. At the end of the day, I think to minimize any sort of loss of life or any sort of negative societal impact, you would most certainly have to be inside of 15 to 21 days. At that point, I think you run the risk of society breaking down, especially at the community levers, and to the point where it's sort of unrecoverable, if you will.
And I think this is the Scott point, so I'm just going to throw this out there. I think that the conversation has to be brief. Most people have over politicized it on the truther networks, and they've said things like, have blown it out of proportions and said, the 10 days of darkness will be, 2 weeks and 3 weeks. And, and I'm going, okay, you cannot kill businesses, because the reality is, if you push into, as you just said too, most people don't have more than two weeks of food or water. If you and we're even talking about the conversation, they're going to shut off all the power, all the internet, and shut off every ability. And I'm going, if you shut off internet, you'll shut off the capabilities of the hospitals to send the information to the patient in the room. No, that's not happening. If you shut off internet, you shut off the ability for the fire station to get information from the police station. No, that doesn't happen. So stop with the internet conversation, because frankly, most people don't even have Cox TV or whatever you want to pick up. They're going to get their information from the internet. And I always kind of say, and I'm sorry, I'm going to bring this in here, that the EBS's original documentation point, if you go back and look at it, was to, in essence, use a pejorative kind of conversation, but was to override the media. So when Kennedy created the EBS, he wanted to override TV and radio to give out governmental messages. Well, nowadays, what we're talking about is TV and radio, sure, but we have social media, because they qualify for that. But it doesn't mean you have to take over all the internet, but you can shut those three down by, by knocking those off and still give the ability to have internet and text message and phone calls and other things here. Does that make any sense to you in that way?
You know, really what you're talking about is what are the military constraints or non-constraints on information free flow when they sort of cash their carte blanche check, right? And this is
Right.
original, so we really don't know. They certainly, because Q tells us, the NSA certainly has the capability to overreach host protocols. In other words, establish sort of their own localized internet, if you will, and do whatever they want with that. So those capabilities do exist. You know, but Q does tell us that there's some sort of a net shutdown that's also sort of planned in the works for this. And what that means, I don't know. Does that mean that we lose power and communications capabilities from something like an EMP, which would almost immediately in the moment trigger a military response, which would have to include in some sort of emergency alert for the nation? And low yield nuclear devices deployed at altitude, by the way, could generate such an EMP pulse. So looking at that process, you know, why do we have the National Guard deploying certainly in metro areas, but even locally where I'm at, I've seen a couple of different Humvees that you don't normally see on the roadways here. We're a pretty small community, about 85,000 people or so. Excuse me. And so at the end of the day, and there is a local Army base, there's an Army reservist base that's here in an airfield. But as it pertains to actually seeing the presence in the streets, it's extremely unusual. I've lived here in my area for about 13 years now. And it's not something that you see. There's not a dedicated training exercise in the year. There's no period of time where you can sort of count on those things. And the skies have been unusually active as well. So why are these things happening? I think you could make the case that if there is some sort of imminent danger, that is posed to the community level, such as hospitals, such as food banks, such as government offices and functions, the post office, mass communication, airports, train stations, things like that. If there is a threat to that, you would want to have a QRF, which is a quick reaction force, on hand in the vicinity or in the area that could deploy immediately to minimize whatever has occurred, right? To minimize the impact of whatever is occurring. I think it's likely that we go through the rest of these events, whatever shape they happen to take out, form as far as that's concerned, and we witness the full-on bare emperor has no clothes style exposure that even the most dead asleep leftists cannot ignore. I think that we're really going to get their attention with the events that are to come. Putin is talking a pretty big rhetoric about the things that are to come with the second phase of these operations. He's talking about how the organizers of this supposed coup, which we know was a counterintelligence operation anyway, but he's talking about the organizers of said coup will be brought to justice. And we know that the organizers, when he's referencing that, are the Five Eyes intelligence community, the NATO intelligence community, and the CIA. So for him to say something like that must mean that we're going to get pretty deep in exposing this sort of rot all the way to the bone. And what better way to save the structure from falling in than sticking the military in place at the last minute, declaring an emergency alert, and then explaining what has occurred.
Well, and so you actually said it's something I've been a very big proponent of. You've actually said three basic points. You said the crimes against humanity, which should be sound of freedom kind of thing, the child trafficking. You said election issues, integrity points, and you talked about COVID issues. Wouldn't those be some of those areas that you would believe needs to be uncovered for public consumption? Would that be a possibility, or are there? Do you want to talk about those areas, or are there some other areas do you think need to be top of mind conversations out there?
Well, those particular three areas are big ones, and we know that they're going to be covered, right? Because they're sort of on the tongue of everyone. The COVID crime is not going away. COVID crime still amounts to the largest coordinated criminal event ever perpetrated against mankind, including the Holocaust, to include all of these horrible genocides that have occurred. This was the most atrocious crime that has ever been committed, and people are aware of that. And that ties directly into biological terrorism, which is really the war crime that the military-industrial complex has been committing since at least the mid-1980s. So as we look at that process and the exposure for that, I think that we tie the justice forward into some sort of World War III style event that pops off where everyone sort of knows what happens. Everyone is watching what's occurring. Everyone's aware of the criminality that's being committed. Everyone is listening to the media parrot the same lies. And we're watching in the narrative space anyway, a degeneration of everything that is law and order, right? And at the end of the day, that leads, I think, to a relatively easy case to make for military justice, for the Nuremberg 2.0 operation that is currently being spearheaded by civilian groups and civilian governments in different areas and municipalities. I think that can be very easily incorporated into a military coalition administration sort of thing between different nations. It could be all of the nations around the world, right? We could include everyone in this. It's probably shrewd, I think, to assume that we would, because everyone has been affected by the COVID-19. Everyone has been affected by the bioterrorism. Everyone has been victimized by the military industrial complex and the Europe and North American based deep state. And so we have to all have a seat at the table, if you will, to what is about to happen, so to speak, when we're talking about the justice phase of all of this. I think that we include court record and different tribunal records that have been taken during this period of time in those tribunals later to come. I think that we provide a lot of these individuals with, 30 to 40 years in prison or the rest of their lives in prison, especially if they haven't committed overt crimes against children or overt crimes against people. Right. I think that we afford them a deal where they keep their life, they're severely punished, but they go on record and they provide a very detailed account of just who told them what to do. And we take that all of the way to the top of the food chain.
Right, like a Huma, Huma Abedin kind of thing. I mean, if she didn't do a lot with HRC, then maybe she gets a 30-year sentence or whatever. I mean, I'm making up something kind of thing, right?
Well, that particular example, I don't know how that would actually play out. Huma's an extraordinarily evil person.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
And we could run into
how much I know on that one.
criminality against that. But that being said, your point remains in principle, regardless of the example. You're talking about getting sort of the confidant, the PA, the personal executive, right, who handles all your business, or your chief of staff, if you will, if you want to call it that, getting them to turn on the big fish, getting the mafia bodyguard to sell out the mafioso. And that's really what we're talking about. And it's occurring all over the world. We've seen a slew of government level resignations, especially at the ministerial level in different nations around the world, and all of the major continents except for South America, that really don't make a lot of sense. You're talking about individuals that had been in office less than 6 months in some cases, and they're resigning for scandal, or they're resigning for personal reasons, or a lot of them were simply no comment. So I think that's a situation where someone has been talked to, someone has been given information, whether it's good or bad, and they're deciding what to do with it. Someone has been offered a chance to take the boot, right? We've seen these boots applied to these different individuals at key times. Katie Hobbs got her nice piece of legwear right after she was supposedly stole the 2022 election cycle in Arizona.
So let's talk about Katie, for instance, as an example. Let's put her, and again, we're pontificating here, okay? So Katie, we know, is a portion of the steal of 2020, okay? Or 2022, excuse me. And she gets her boot out in the, we see it on the air, on the tarmac, right? And then we see her being chased by someone in, I saw something where she was getting chased while she's trying to work out or whatever. So, and someone's asking her questions. She doesn't want to answer any questions. And I'm thinking, okay, if you broke your foot, and this is what, 3 months later or 4 months later, you can't walk that fast, down a hallway. So obviously you didn't break your foot, that was the arrest point, kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, she's arrested, she gets her boot thing, and then she goes to not having her boot anymore. How does that work? I mean, or how do you think that might be working there?
Well, when we consider that this isn't a regular war, and we're talking about this situation where they're booted and they look like they're in submission, and then they're not again, and now they're in charge of things, and now things are going absolutely nuts, and
Right.
this sort of thing. This is an unusual situation, right? We like to think of conventional warfare as linear in some fashion. Whether it's a linear response, whether it's a linear metric for communication, whether it's a linear idea of what warfare is, the doctrine, right? We'd like to think that we fight all together under the same doctrine, but that's really not true at the end of the day. And so things like Katie Hobbs in this irregular war situation, what that reads to me like, if I was just to give my opinion on it, is that we've got someone who entered into submission, entered into a plea of some sort, and has agreed to play a role in exchange for their knowledge, in exchange for dragging out the individuals that maybe coerced them, the individuals that had the blackmail or the bribery on them, who paid them, who got to you in the middle of the night, what death threat finally did it for you, where you sold out the United States and committed treason, what happened. And so
maybe how the election happened in Tucson or in Phoenix, and what she did to do something, and who are the key individuals and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. What I think what we're talking about is battlefield reconnaissance, human intelligence, right? We're talking about getting direct information about what is occurring on the field of battle in real time from someone who has agreed to defect, but has also committed serious crimes. And so they're not going to get off that easy. So what do? We, in the same fashion that we would put the kidnapper back in the room with the parents, we are now putting the thief back in the store with the owners of the diamond store, right? And we're allowing it all to play out, and for it to be shown very clearly and plainly that this is not someone who is aligned with the people. In other words, she is being her legacy is sort of being destroyed,
right?
It's likely that was a condition in exchange for her being allowed to probably keep her life and rot in prison for the rest of her life after we go through this process,
right? And so, I mean, if you're now pontificate, like, the tribunals are showing next week, let's just say, and we're talking about Katie. Let's just use Katie as an example. What might they show in that way of Katie, for instance, if we are just kind of guessing upon that point?
Well, when we consider what Katie, what her level is, right? She was Secretary of State for Arizona, I think, during the 2020 election, if I'm not mistaken. There was absolute horrendous corruption in the 2020 election. We all know that.
Correct.
We know that the Hobbs office coordinated with the governor of that time to sort of satisfy that fraudulent act, right? And make all of that go through with the COVID and the restrictions and things of that nature. But we're talking about state level governmental actors here in the United States. What that would translate to around the rest of the world would be sort of provincial level, right? Or municipality level, depending on how large tracts of land are segmented in your nation state. But what that amounts to is a relatively low rung on the ladder. We're talking about a deep state apparatus that goes very, very high in the areas of government and finance. And there's a point above the governmental level that we can publicly see where the government and finance realms actually blend with one another and become one in the same realm. And so as we go through the process, getting people like, Hobbs and getting people like other state level actors, there's different governors that have committed fraud. There's different state legislators that have committed fraud. There's a lot of them that know that that things have been fraudulent and that they've been allowing it to go on for a long time. So going through this process and getting the information that a lot of them possess, especially if we can provide them a way to, maybe take out that deal, right? And have the life in prison option versus, a bullet to the head for committing treason and really, amounting to the destruction and the overthrow of the United States of America. It's one of the more serious crimes that you can commit. But in exchange for their information, if we can take out the entire Hydra, if we can get every single head, if we can get any sort of valuable reconnaissance and intelligence, from these operations at that state actor level, that provincial actor level, and take it on up the food chain, I think we can almost guarantee success. But we have to be extremely delicate and methodical about it, because we don't want any of those ancillary fish to get away.
So in essence, the Katie Hobbs in the whole ring of the election points is just a bit actor, And that's probably not one of those things you're going to see the whole, storyline in there. You're really going to be focusing more on the Biden, kind of conversation than really the Katie Hobbs. We're going to be, and that's why I've always kind of said to people, it's going to be a shorter period of time. Doesn't mean that down the road you're not going to see her, 6 months down the road, 8 months down the road, 10 months down the road. You're going to see some lingering conversation that's going to happen, but it doesn't have to be upfront, in your face. And we're going to have to keep going on for 30, 40, 50 days of EBS conversations where we're shutting the nation down, and then no one can eat, no one can work, and no one can do anything. Would that make sense?
Absolutely. And the situation you just described would be illogical on its face. If we're going to put the country through a cog operation so that we can drain the swamp everywhere, not just in DC, but from all around the world, and trusting the American people to take the brunt of it, to handle the shouldering of a lot of these operations, right? And a lot of the narrative cover, which is having to be given right now, that amounts to the reality that we're experiencing. It's mostly cover for very serious operations. And so as we look at that, we're being asked, there's a lot that's being asked of the American population, but I know, and we all know that we can handle it. But there does become a point of, I think, bona fide diminishing returns that can't be allowed, because it would defeat the entire purpose of the operation in general. To allow a catastrophic emergency situation to occur and actually kinetically take out a portion of the population in different areas around the world. First off, that's evil. And secondly, it would not be able, you wouldn't have a salvageable situation post reconciliation of whatever those events were. There would forever be this destabilization that would probably lend itself to falling right back into the vacuum of power in certain areas and in key areas of the world.
Well, I mean, I say this. I mean, listen, I am a business owner, and I know that businesses, most businesses would not survive being shut for 2, 3, 4 weeks. I just can tell you that we would not be able to make it. And so if you're shutting us down and you're shutting off everyone, you're not going to have businesses being there anymore. So that would lend itself toward the communist viewpoint. You need to have a shorter EBS kind of thing, and then let's get back into the real world of this thing. And yes, you're going to have a time frame of a water cooler discussion, but we need to get people back into the road of getting back to work, getting back into the reality of things, and understanding that, after work, there's going to be a lot of conversations and a lot of healing that's going to happen. But we need people to get back to work, in essence. So, I mean, I still kind of say, hey, listen, we can't just shut it all off just because we want to go all the way from Biden to Katie Hobbs and then down to the local mayor of your town, kind of thing. Oops, did we lose you?
Apologies there. I had issues with the audio on my end.
That's right.
Points well made. We're really not sure how it's all going to plan out. I think a lot of that's by design. I think at the end of the day, we have empirical evidence to show that the operations that are occurring have certainly averted the worst of the catastrophes, right? They've certainly minimized, I think, to the greatest degree, existential threats to mankind. The COVID pandemic for what it was, and it was a bioweapon, right? And it was the vector for another bioweapon, an even more sinister one. But as far as the actual virus itself, relatively innocuous, relatively low fatality rate, just about everywhere, I think.
Correct.
And so that in and of itself was almost like a soft, it's like getting in trouble and getting a very light spanking as opposed to the hardcore one that you might have been expecting or that might have been coming initially. But going through the process, there are a number of things I think that are still being accounted for, and we really don't know what the time frame on that is going to take. I think it's very telling with the rhetoric coming out of Russia. I think it's very telling with President Trump stepping up this idea of election interference. He's posting almost every single day now describing something related to election interference, and he's highlighting a lot of the corruption in the justice system, which is supposed to be the last fail-safe the last preservation of an organized society is the rule of law and the execution of law, right? Chris Miller has gone on record now at least one time and said that the U.S. military and different military powers around the world, depending on your laws and doctrines, can enforce civilian law enforcement. They can be used for domestic preservation, but only when the civilian sector of society is broken down. In other words, there's an inability to function in a critical fashion, kind of like the ones that we described earlier. I can't imagine that sort of a response taking very long.
Right. And I think the first time I ever saw, or at least heard, that was in the very first Clay Clark, one of his awakening kind of things. And the Tulsa sheriff stood up and talked about that. He said, listen, I'm not beholden to anyone, in essence. I mean, he was talking about the people. I am. But, that when you realize the sheriff of your town and your county, that guy is the big dog of your area. And you don't realize that guy is a really important person in really upholding the law and really upholding the Constitution. And it's very important to a lot of those areas. And so I want to kind of, as we're wrapping up here, I know a lot of people look to you and ask you a lot of questions. One thing that everyone has to know about all of us is that we're trying to give you information. No one has the actual knowledge of the events. We're not plugged into the Q team, and we have the actual event knowledge of the moment that this is all going to happen. We just have a few ideas and some logic points. Do you want to say any kind of final words in that kind of vein?
Well, I think in that kind of vein, you're exactly right. Q says that it must be open source. Q says that there are no outside comms. Q says that there are no leaks, right? And then in some respects, there have to be no leaks for good reason. There is an extreme amount of military intelligence information control that's going back and forth in the world right now. And I think it's worth highlighting that arena is not privy, I think, in many respects, to 99% at least of the civilian population. You might have that 1% of extraordinary individuals who have extraordinary connections or extraordinary skill sets honed over a period of years that are able to dial in more closely on what may actually be occurring. But you can also be assured that most of those individuals would be well aware enough based on their skill sets to not say anything about it.
Right.
As we look at this process, we do have a map of sorts. Q tells us that the news sort of unlocks the map. We can infer what is actually occurring in the world in a lot of ways and a lot of times based on what's going on in the news. If we look at their presentation, for example, the perception that they're attempting to create and flip the perception, the information on his face may be worthwhile.
Right.
At the very least, it may point to a greater rabbit hole to research. Maybe the numbers are forged or made up, but it pointed you to an interesting organization that has a lot of pull and a lot of sway. That happens a lot in the mainstream space.
Right.
So we do have some sort of a semblance of a map, right, of how things are going. But I would say almost to anybody that rather than concern ourselves so much with how they may be going, appreciating how far we've come, I think is really the order of the day at this point. We have inverted a half century of MK Ultra mind control programming in a vast majority of the population in 8 years. That is an unbelievable amount of progress. That's literally doing it in an 80% discount style way, right? We were 80% more effective in our awakening process than they have ever been with the MK Ultra. It's truly amazing, and I think it's worth highlighting that we're getting a lot of those centrists now, and a lot of those socially progressive liberals, and a lot of those classical liberals who are more interested in privacy, though their social ideologies may be a little bit counterintuitive depending on their lens on other things. They want privacy. A lot of them enjoy the fact that they're allowed to own a gun even though they don't necessarily want to have one. And so these sorts of ideas, especially by those that have an education and don't really participate a lot in the polling space or in the social media space, they're penetrating in a big way, and we're coming along at a very fantastic pace. I can't imagine us getting all of the way to the November 2024 election. And I would contend with anyone that perhaps we see a series of events play off in the world over these next 15 months that compel us into an original moment where things are sort of transformed by the governmental process, right? Maybe we throw off the bureaucracy. Maybe we have military intervention at the public level, right? An interim government of some sort. Maybe we have an interim civilian government put in place that returns the nations to the people in a very orderly, I would say almost pomp and circumstance style fashion. I would think it would be very ceremonial. I think it would be very symbolic and very significant. And so as we go through that process, who's to say that by November of 2024, we don't have access through that transformative process to the first really free election in the United States in 60 years?
Right. So in essence, some level of, we've already taken it over. And then by that 2024 election, we're really coming up with, we've already had our republic, but now we're actually creating a real republic type election that we haven't had for, I would say, for more than 100 years, possibly. So yeah, that would be wonderful to see.
Absolutely, my friend. So those are my closing thoughts. And, at the end of the day, there are so many people now that are awake that when Q says nothing can stop what is coming, I think that we're more apt to say nothing can stop what has already happened. The critical mass for awakening the rest of humanity has already been exceeded. We exceeded 6 and 10 a long time ago. Yeah. I do believe by the time we end the movie, we'll have, and some of it is not a movie, it's worth highlighting that. But when I say movie, I mean the overall chess game, if we want to refer to that in the irregular warfare space. By the time we get to the end of that process, I really do believe we'll have 8 or 9 and 10 people on average, pretty much on the same page with what has occurred and okay with moving forward.
Yeah, I always say that. I always say it like this, and I know people might not like this kind of point, but I'm a fiction writer as well, and there's something that happens in fiction. It's called the climax. So as you're going along, you'll hit a climax point. Most people don't ever recognize the climax, but it's the turning point. It's the turning point of your protagonist, your character. And as you see that turning point, that's the point that it's normally the worst point for that character. And that point of where that character turns, but that the audience doesn't always know it. And the author knows it, the director knows it, but that's the turning point. And we've reached that point, and that's just exactly what you said. We reached that point a long time ago. And see, the media, the government, Hollywood has been trying to, push water uphill for a very long time, and they are so gone. They can't possibly put this thing back, the cat back in the bag. It's done. The bag is ripped up, and so I think we're about ready to see some wonderful time frames. So thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, sir. Enjoyable conversation.
All right. Hey, and just like and follow us here and subscribe, and we'll be back with you some other time. All right. All right. Thanks so much.